Soft was the word she used. Fragile. For 24 years, those labels were hammered into my skull by the woman who gave me life. Today, staring at a classified map while a decorated Navy SEAL commander pleads for my tactical help, those words taste like ash. Welcome to the front line. Childhood in the Brown household wasn't a nurturing environment. It was a constant, grueling performance evaluation. Margaret Brown, a former Army trauma surgeon who had seen the absolute worst of humanity during her tours, ran her home like a frontline triage center. Compassion was a finite resource, heavily rationed and rarely dispensed. If you weren't actively bleeding out, you were simply wasting her time. Growing up, my defining characteristic in her eyes was an unforgivable vulnerability. Asthma kept me indoors during the brutal Minnesota winters, and a quiet, highly analytical nature made me a prime target for her sharp, cynical tongue. While other mothers clapped enthusiastically at piano recitals, Margaret checked her watch. When I cried over a broken wrist at age 10, she coldly wrapped it in a makeshift splint herself, muttering under her breath about how I lacked the basic fortitude to survive the real world. "You're a dandelion, Chelsea," she told me on my 18th birthday, sipping black coffee as I packed my bags for college. "The first stiff breeze is going to blow you apart. Stick to the libraries. Leave the heavy lifting to people with a spine." Words like that leave scars significantly deeper than any surgical scalpel. They shape your internal monologue. For years, her relentless voice was the primary narrator of my life, whispering that I was an imposter, a weak link, just waiting to snap under pressure. I studied linguistics and cryptography, burying myself in dead languages, complex ciphers, and acoustic wave patterns. It was safe. It was indoor work. It was exactly the kind of invisible, sheltered existence she expected of me. Graduation day came and went without her attendance. She had a medical symposium in Chicago and deemed it a higher priority. Standing completely alone in my cap and gown, clutching a degree in geopolitical linguistics, something inside me finally fractured. It wasn't a break of weakness, but the sharp, jagged snapping of a tether. I didn't want to be safe anymore. I wanted to prove her wrong. More than that, I needed to prove to myself that the dandelion she despised had roots made of forged iron. Enlisting in the military was the most terrifying decision of my life. I bypassed the standard administrative roles my recruiter casually suggested and pushed aggressively for a high-stress, high-attrition pathway. Airborne cryptologic linguist. When I called Margaret from basic training, my voice hoarse from screaming cadences in the rain, her response was a dry, utterly humorless chuckle. "You? Military?" she scoffed, the static of the payphone amplifying her disdain. "Chelsea, you'll be crying in your bunk by Friday. Call me when they process your administrative discharge." She hung up. I didn't cry. Instead, I channeled every single ounce of her rejection into raw fuel. Basic training was a physical and psychological nightmare. My lungs burned, my muscles screamed, and there were nights I honestly thought my body would just shut down. But every time I considered ringing the bell to quit, Margaret's voice echoed in the back of my mind. Soft. Fragile. Dandelion. I pushed through. I didn't just survive, I excelled. The military didn't care about my childhood asthma or my quiet, reserved demeanor. They cared that I could process auditory chaos, filter out deafening static, and pinpoint linguistic anomalies faster than anyone else in my cohort. I developed a unique gift for hearing exactly what wasn't being said. By my 25th birthday, I was stationed at a Joint Forces forward operating base in the Middle East, embedded directly with a Tier 1 intelligence unit. Despite the heavy commendations and the hard-earned respect of my peers, the ghost of my mother's judgment lingered heavily over my shoulders. We spoke rarely. When we did, she dismissed my highly classified work as glorified eavesdropping. To her, real soldiers kicked down doors. Real soldiers bled in the dirt. I was just playing dress-up with a computer and a headset. Little did she know, my headset was about to become the most critical weapon in an entire theater of war. Dust coated absolutely everything at Forward Operating Base Delta. It was an insidious, chalky powder that infiltrated sealed laptops, military rations, and our lungs. The desert heat was oppressive, but inside the SCIF, Sensitive Compartmented Information Facility, the air conditioning blasted at a freezing 60 degrees. This windowless, heavily fortified room, humming constantly with the sound of encrypted server racks, was my domain. Tensions had been escalating violently in the region for months. A splinter cell of insurgents, highly organized and brutally efficient, had been operating in the treacherous mountainous border region. They were practically a ghost unit striking quickly and vanishing into the terrain without leaving a single digital footprint. Conventional military intelligence was entirely blind to them. It was a Tuesday evening when the encrypted tactical channels went chaotic. A joint extraction team, comprising Green Berets and local allied forces, had been ambushed during a routine reconnaissance patrol in the Kadir Valley. Communication was severed abruptly. The last transmission was a frantic, terrifying burst of gunfire and static, followed by an agonizing silence. The entire base went into immediate, high-alert lockdown. For 3 agonizing days, we heard nothing. The atmosphere in the command center grew thicker with dread by the hour. Then, a faint, intermittent signal was picked up by our orbital relays. It wasn't standard military encrypted comms. It was old-school, analog bounce, a desperate, improvised SOS masked cleverly beneath the commercial radio chatter of a nearby civilian town. Every senior analyst in the room missed it. They were looking for high-tech, digital signatures and standard distress beacons. But I had spent my entire childhood listening to the subtle, almost imperceptible shifts in my mother's tone, constantly anticipating the storm before it hit. I knew exactly how to find the hidden pattern in the noise. I isolated the frequency. It was a tapping sequence. Not Morse code, but a highly localized tactical tap code used exclusively by elite special operations units when their primary comms were compromised. "I have them!" I announced, my voice cutting sharply through the frantic murmurs of the skiff. Within minutes, the heavy steel door to the intel suite banged open. Commander DeJuan Marshall, the commanding officer of the Naval Special Warfare Task Unit deployed to our base, stormed in. Marshall was a living legend, a man carved from granite with hollow eyes that had seen far too many flag-draped coffins. He didn't walk, he stalked. "Who found it?" Marshall barked, his intense gaze sweeping over the rows of startled analysts. My supervisor pointed directly at me. "Specialist Brown, sir." Marshall loomed over my workstation, his presence entirely suffocating. "Talk to me, Brown. Where are my men?" I quickly pulled up the complex topographic map on the main overhead screen. "They aren't just hiding, Commander. They've been taken." The tap code indicates they are being held in a subterranean structure, likely an abandoned Soviet-era bunker complex near the northern ridge of the Kadir Valley. The signal is incredibly weak because they are deep underground, manually bouncing it off a metal ventilation shaft. Marshall's jaw tightened, a muscle feathering in his cheek. The Kadir Valley is a labyrinth of caves. We send a rescue team in there blind. It's a suicide mission. We need an exact structural layout and the enemy's guard rotations. Can you get that from the taps? No, I replied smoothly, ignoring the cold sweat prickling the back of my neck. But I don't need the taps for that. I've been analyzing this specific cell's localized broadcast propaganda for 6 months. I brought up a secondary screen displaying my operational matrix. Linguistic isolation. They speak a hyper-specific, localized dialect of Pashto, mixed with older tribal slang, making standard translation software useless. Acoustic masking. They hide their internal patrol coordinates within public prayer broadcasts. Rotational phrasing. They change their guard shift codes every 4 hours, based on lunar positioning. I know their dialect, their command structure, and their operational habits, I continued, meeting Marshall's hardened gaze. If we tap directly into their localized radio mesh network, I can map the bunker's activity in real time. Marshall stared at me, openly sizing me up. I felt a fleeting, terrifying echo of my mother's critical gaze, dissecting my worth. But I forced myself to hold his stare. I wasn't a fragile child anymore. "Do it," Marshall commanded. For the next 12 hours, I didn't eat, drink, or sleep. I successfully bypassed their primitive analog encryption and slipped completely unnoticed into their internal communication loop. It was a chaotic, deafening mess of colloquial slang and heavily coded phrases. but I translated it on the fly. I mapped out the sentry positions, the heavy weapon caches, and the exact subterranean cell where the captive American soldiers were being held. When I finally printed and handed the completed tactical blueprint to Commander Marshall, I fully expected him to nod, take the intel, and leave. Instead, he rigorously reviewed the dossier, his expression darkening with every page. "This dialect," Marshall said, aggressively tapping the transcripts. "It's highly irregular. If my boys go in there, and the enemy suddenly shifts their comms protocol during the breach, my team won't know if they're walking into a fatal ambush. The automated translation software on our TAC pads will be dead weight against this localized slang. You'll need a live overwatch," I said, pointing to the base's massive comms array. "I can stay right here on the line, feed you real-time translations, and provide movement updates over the radio as you breach." Marshall shook his head gravely. "The Valley's natural magnetic interference is way too high. Remote comms from this fob will drop the very second we enter the cave system. We need the overwatch close. Inside the valley." He slowly looked up from the map and met my eyes. The silence in the crowded intelligence room suddenly became deafening. "Specialist Brown," Marshall said, his voice dropping an octave, losing its sharp military bark and taking on a tone of quiet, intense desperation. "My men are dying down there in the dark. I don't trust a single other analyst on this base to navigate this audio environment. I need you, on the ground, sitting in the mobile command center at the very edge of the hot zone." My commanding officer immediately stepped forward, protesting loudly. "Sir, with all due respect, Brown is an intelligence analyst. She is not a combat operator. Sending her into an active hot zone is a direct violation of protocol." "Protocol be damned!" Marshall roared, slamming his heavy fist onto the table, making the monitors shake. "She knows their language, she knows their movements, and she's the only damn reason we even know those boys are still breathing. If I go in blind, I'm bringing back body bags." He turned back to me, completely ignoring my CO's outrage. "I am begging you, Brown, lead the intel on this rescue. Come with us." The massive request hung heavily in the freezing air of the skiff, a desk jockey, a fragile dandelion, being openly begged by a hardened Navy SEAL to step directly onto the battlefield. I thought of Margaret. I thought of the endless years of being told I was simply too weak for the harsh realities of the world. I stood up, pushing my heavy chair back. "When do we leave, Commander?" Helicopters vibrated with a bone-rattling intensity that no amount of basic training could ever prepare a person for. Crammed into the back of the Black Hawk, surrounded by the towering, heavily armed operators of Commander Dejuan Marshall's SEAL team, the reality of my situation finally set in. The air tasted metallic, thick with the stench of jet fuel and adrenaline. Below us, the Kadir Valley yawned like a massive, jagged scar carved into the earth, swallowed entirely by the pitch-black desert night. Fear is a highly curious mechanism. Growing up, my fear was entirely domestic, tied to the sharp click of Margaret's heels in the hallway, or the heavy, disappointed sighs she exhaled whenever I failed to meet her impossible standards. Out here, soaring over hostile territory in a stripped-down aircraft, the fear was primal. It was loud. Yet, strangely, it felt infinitely more manageable than the suffocating judgment of my childhood home. We touched down 3 miles from the target zone, the downdraft kicking up a blinding sandstorm. I was immediately shoved into the back of a heavily modified MRAP, mine-resistant ambush-protected vehicle, that served as our mobile tactical operations center. The interior was cramped, lit only by the harsh green glow of communication arrays and topographic monitors. Outside, Marshall and his men vanished into the rocky terrain, completely silent, moving like shadows, detaching themselves from the darkness. "Comms check, Overwatch," Marshall's voice crackled softly through my headset. "We are approaching the primary fissure, going dark on standard frequencies." "Copy that, Viper 1. I replied, my hands flying across the terminal to lock on to the localized analog frequencies. "I am stepping into their network now." The transition was jarring. 1 second, I was listening to the crisp, disciplined silence of American special operators. The next, my ears were flooded with the chaotic, heavily staticked chatter of the insurgent network. It was a messy, undisciplined web of overlapping voices, full of regional idioms and tribal slang. "The hounds are asleep," one voice muttered in a thick, mountainous dialect. "Keep the lanterns low. The wind is shifting," another replied. I closed my eyes, tuning out the hum of the MRAP's engine, and let the linguistics wash over me. To an untrained ear, it was meaningless poetry. To me, it was a perfectly clear tactical blueprint. "The hounds are asleep" meant the perimeter guards were stationed but relaxed. "The wind is shifting" was a rotational code. The subterranean guards were swapping shifts. "Viper 1, this is Overwatch," I whispered into the mic. "You have a two-man sentry at the mouth of the cave. They are currently facing west, distracted. Shift rotation happening in the lower levels in exactly 4 minutes." "Solid copy," Marshall breathed. A tense minute passed. Sentries neutralized. We are in the belly of the beast. For the next 20 minutes, I became the eyes and ears of a blind rescue squad. I navigated Marshall's team through the labyrinthine tunnels, translating the careless whispers of the enemy. I steered them past heavily fortified checkpoints and guided them through secondary ventilation shafts. The deeper they went, the heavier the magnetic interference from the iron-rich mountain became, filling my headset with a rising tide of white noise. Then, the auditory landscape shifted abruptly. A new voice crackled over the enemy frequency. It wasn't a low-level guard. The cadence was authoritative, sharp, and highly urgent. He spoke incredibly fast, using a rare, archaic subset of the regional dialect that the standard military translators hadn't documented since the Soviet occupation. "The metal birds woke the mountain. The trap is set at the iron door. Let the ghosts walk into the fire, then seal the throat." My blood ran absolutely cold. They knew. The insurgents had heard the distant helicopters. The intel we had was suddenly entirely obsolete. The iron door was the entrance to the primary subterranean cell where we believed the hostages were being held. It wasn't a holding cell anymore. It was a rigged explosive trap, and Marshall's team was walking directly toward it. "Viper 1, abort!" I yelled into the microphone. "Viper 1, do not approach the primary cell. It's a deadfall. The door is wired." Silence. Just the sickening, rhythmic hiss of dead static. The magnetic interference of the mountain had finally severed the MRAP's connection to their deep tunnel tactical radios. Panic, cold and sharp, gripped my chest. I slapped the side of the comms array, desperately cycling through booster frequencies. Nothing. The technician beside me shook his head grimly. "We've lost them, Brown. The rock is too dense. We can't push a signal through from down here. If Marshall breached that iron door, the entire mountain would come down on top of them, burying the SEALs and the captive soldiers alive." "You're a dandelion, Chelsea. The first stiff breeze is going to blow you apart." Margaret's voice echoed in my head, loud and mocking. This was it. This was the moment she had always predicted. The moment the pressure became too much, and I simply folded. I ripped the headset off, grabbed a heavy, portable tactical radio from the equipment rack, and slammed my hand against the MRAP's heavy rear door release. "Brown, what the hell are you doing?" the technician shouted, grabbing my shoulder. "You are strictly ordered to stay in this vehicle. The signal can't penetrate the rock from the valley floor," I shouted back, shoving his hand away with a fierce strength I didn't know I possessed. "I have to get to higher ground. I need a direct line of sight to the fissure entrance to bounce the UHF signal down the tunnel shaft." Before he could stop me, I kicked the door open and plunged out into the freezing, hostile night. The cold air hit my lungs like shattered glass. Immediately, my chest tightened. Asthma, the very weakness my mother had used to define my entire existence, flared violently in the dusty, freezing atmosphere. Every breath was a ragged, agonizing wheeze. I ignored it. I clutched the heavy radio to my chest and began to sprint up the treacherous, loose shale incline of the mountain ridge. My boots slipped on the jagged rocks, tearing the skin from my palms as I scrambled for purchase. The wind howled furiously, biting through my standard-issue fatigues. I had no weapon, no night vision goggles, and absolutely no combat training for a situation like this. I was completely exposed, a sitting duck for any insurgent sniper scanning the ridgeline. "Leave the heavy lifting to people with a spine," her voice whispered. "Shut up," I gasped out loud, my vision blurring at the edges as my starved lungs begged for oxygen. Just shut up. I reached the crest of the ridge. Below me, the dark fissure of the cave entrance loomed like an open mouth. I dropped to my knees, blood dripping from my scraped hands, and extended the radio antenna outward, pointing it directly down into the abyss of the cave to bypass the mountain's external magnetic shielding. I keyed the mic, my thumb trembling violently. Viper 1, this is Overwatch. Come in. Viper 1, do you copy? Static. I wheezed heavily, my chest heaving, desperately fighting off a full-blown asthma attack. Dejuan, please. I choked into the mic, breaking protocol entirely. Do not open the iron door. It's a bomb. Do you hear me? The iron door is a bomb. A horrific second of silence dragged on. Then, a sharp crackle of static pierced the speaker. Overwatch, this is Viper 1, Marshall's voice barked, breathless and tight. We read you. We are stacked outside the iron door. Stand by. Pull back, I screamed into the radio. The hostages aren't in there. The enemy commander ordered them to seal the throat. They moved the prisoners to the choke point near the secondary egress. Copy that. Redirecting to secondary egress. Red team, on me. Move, move, move. For the next 10 minutes, I remained frozen on that freezing ridge, clutching the radio as muffled subterranean thuds echoed from deep within the mountain. Gunfire, heavy and rapid, vibrated through the soles of my boots. I listened to the entire brutal choreography of the firefight through the analog frequencies, providing split-second translations as the enemy tried desperately to coordinate a defense against the SEALs. They are flanking the water reserves. Bring up the heavy guns. Viper 1, they are moving a heavy machine gun to your left flank, near the cistern. I relayed. Target acquired. Flank neutralized, Marshall replied moments later. It was a deadly dance in the absolute dark, and I was calling the rhythm. Finally, a massive, ground-shaking explosion rocked the valley. A plume of dust shot out of the cave entrance below me. The insurgents had detonated the iron door trap, entirely obliterating the empty cell. Had Marshall's team breached it 2 minutes earlier, they would have been instantly vaporized. Then the radio crackled one last time. Overwatch, this is Viper 1. Primary targets secured. All 4 packages are alive and breathing. We are coming home, Brown. I collapsed backward onto the cold, unforgiving rock, the heavy radio slipping from my bloody fingers. I stared up at the vast, indifferent canopy of desert stars, my chest heaving, taking in massive, agonizing gulps of air. I was freezing, battered, and entirely exhausted. But I was not broken. 2 days later, the sun was blindingly bright as I walked across the tarmac at Forward Operating Base Delta. The dust was still suffocating, but it felt entirely different now. It felt like victory. Commander DeJuan Marshall was waiting near the transport plane that would take the rescued soldiers stateside. He looked battered, his face bruised, his uniform caked in dried mud, but his hollow eyes were bright with a fierce, unmistakable respect. As I approached, this living legend, a man who had seen the absolute worst of war, stopped and snapped a crisp, perfectly rigid salute. He didn't say a word. He didn't have to. The respect radiating from him was louder than any command. I returned the salute, my back perfectly straight, my hands bandaged, but steady. When I finally returned to the skiff, the heavy silence of the intelligence room felt welcoming. I sat at my desk, stared at the encrypted satellite phone, and made a decision I had been putting off for my entire life. I dialed Margaret's number. She answered on the 3rd ring. Chelsea, it's the middle of the workday. Is there an administrative emergency at your desk? Her voice was just as crisp, just as laced with that familiar, patronizing edge. No emergency, Mother, I replied. My voice was calm, completely devoid of the usual anxious tremor that always accompanied our conversations. It felt entirely foreign, yet perfectly tailored to my throat. Then why are you calling? She sighed, the sound of rustling paperwork echoing in the background. I have a surgical board meeting in 10 minutes. I just wanted to update you on my career, I said, leaning back in my heavy chair. 2 nights ago, I deployed into an active combat zone in the Kadir Valley. I overrode protocol, left an armored convoy, and manually established a tactical relay on an exposed mountain ridge during a severe localized sandstorm. The rustling of paperwork on her end stopped entirely. A Tier 1 SEAL team was walking into a rigged explosive ambush, I continued, my voice steady, relaying the facts with the clinical precision she had always demanded but never believed I possessed. I intercepted their comms, translated an undocumented dialect in real time, and redirected the breach. We saved 4 American soldiers. The commanding officer formally submitted my name for the Bronze Star this morning. There was nothing but a heavy, profound silence on the line. For the first time in 25 years, Margaret Brown was entirely speechless. "You always told me I was a dandelion, Mom," I said softly, staring at the dark monitor of my workstation. "You told me the first stiff breeze would blow me apart. You were right about the dandelion. But you were wrong about what happens when the wind blows." I took a deep, steady breath, my lungs feeling clearer than they had in a lifetime. The wind doesn't destroy the dandelion. It just scatters the seeds. It makes it conquer the whole damn field. I don't need you to tell me I'm strong anymore. I already know. I didn't wait for her to respond. I didn't need to hear her justification, her sudden pride, or her ongoing denial. I simply reached forward and pressed the red button, cutting the connection. The line went dead, leaving me in the quiet hum of the server room. I wasn't fragile. I wasn't soft. I was an airborne cryptologic linguist, and I had just commanded the battlefield. Did Chelsea's journey from a misunderstood daughter to a frontline tactical hero keep you on the edge of your seat? We all face doubts, but true strength comes from within. If you loved this intense story of resilience, courage, and proving the doubters wrong, please hit that like button. Share this video with someone needing a reminder of their hidden power, and don't forget to subscribe to our channel for more thrilling, real-life audio stories. See you next time.